It was 10th of June 2000, when London's famous Millennium Bridge was opened after its construction for public. For the last 2 years, people had been waiting for the completion of its construction anxiously, so when it was opened, everyone wanted to use it on the very first day. It was built to cross the Thames River in London for pedestrians only, but as the people started walking on it, it began to sway badly. After noticing it, the authorities came in action. First 2 days, they forbade the people to make rush on the bridge, but after 2 days, it was closed for next 2 years. After this incident, this famous Bridge of London had been noticed by the world. The engineers who built this bridge were shocked to see how such a solid bridge can sway just because people walk on it. It had such a reason which could not be predicted by the engineers earlier. It was such a problem which courage to go against the laws of nature and jiggle the great mystery of physics. Before starting this video, I would like to recommend you for spending your time watching such informational and educational videos, because there are thousands of ways to waste time on social media, but by watching such videos, you get better understanding of the world and you gain some knowledge. If you want to watch more knowledgeable videos like this one, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for more videos notifications. About 192 years ago, in 1831, some soldiers of British Army were parading and walking over Broughton Suspension Bridge situated in northern England. Due to the synchronization of the footsteps of the soldiers, Broughton Suspension Bridge collapsed and 60 soldiers fell in the river and many of them were seriously injured. Luckily there were no casualties in this incident. But after that day, British Army instructed their soldiers not to pray together while crossing any bridge. It was practiced not only by the British Army, but also was practiced by every army of the world for next several years. It is followed even today in some countries. It was due to the synchronization of the footsteps of soldiers which collapsed the bridge, but if we look into the footage of London's Millennium Bridge, we notice something very strange here. People walking on this bridge are not soldiers, and why their footsteps are so synchronized, and why this modern footbridge built in 21st century could not tolerate their synchronization. We find its answer from an experiment done back in 350 years. In 1665, famous physicist Christian Huygens made the world's first pendulum clock. Its purpose was to guide the sailors their exact location in the sea. Sailors in the past used to estimate their location in the sea according to the position of the sun and stars, but that was merely an estimate. They could only know the latitude, means north and south position. But if they knew the accurate time, they could know the longitude or their east and west location. At that time, clocks would lose 15 minutes in 24 hours either faster or slower, and they were useless for that purpose. The pendulum clock made by Huygens would lose only 15 seconds in a day. Huygens' plan was to hang two pendulum clocks with heavy weights, so that the ocean waves could not disturb the motion of the clocks, and if any of the clocks went bad, there should be a backup clock. He hanged the both pendulum clocks on a wood to test them in his home, and started both clocks one after the other. But after some time he noticed that both of the clocks were synchronized. The pendulum of left clock moved to left, while the pendulum of right clock moved to right at the same time. Huygens could not understand the strange behavior of the clocks. He again disturbed the pendulum movement of both clocks, but after 30 minutes both got synchronized again. Huygens thought that there might be a connection of air pressure between these two clocks, so he placed a cardboard between them, but after 2 minutes both clocks synchronized again. At last, he separated both clocks from each other. He hanged one of the clocks to one chair and the other clock to another chair. Then he noticed that the invisible connection of the clocks had broken. But what was the connection between them when they were hanging on the same wooden stick? In this video, 32 metronomes are being started in different times, placing them on the same table. It means their starting is not synchronized, but only after 2 minutes. All 32 metronomes are surprisingly synchronized. Whereas they don't have any connection apparently with each other except the table, This secret connection of synchronization does not only apply on non-living things. The fireflies are also good friends of each other. It has been noticed in a research that, when fireflies are together, they shine unanimously after synchronizing with each other. For this, it is important that their flash could reach each other. If they are far away from each other, the synchronization of flashing will break up. The more fireflies in an area, the more are the chances that they will flash together after synchronizing with each other. In the very same way, we the humans synchronize with each other. Here in this window the audience is clapping for a performance. In the beginning, everyone was clapping according to his own frequency, but what happened after that, you can see yourself. No one told them to do so, but even then they synchronized the frequency of their clapping. This phenomenon of synchronization is not limited to one or two things. If we take the example of heart, the heart pumps with the synchronization of our body. If a normal person runs faster, his heart rate will increase at the same time, because the heart has to supply oxygenated blood to brain. But if there is a problem with heart, its synchronization does not match to the body. It is known as irregular heartbeat, or arrhythmias in medical terms. In this condition the heart rate or the pulse increases itself. Now heart is pumping more blood but lungs cannot inhale more oxygen. Hereby, oxygen and blood supply to brain will decrease, and it can cause the death of a person in this situation. Similarly, a decrease in heart rate can cause the death of a person. It means, where less synchronization is harmful, the excessive synchronization can also create problems. Keeping all these examples in mind, we once again have a look at the Millennium Bridge. It so happened, when such a large number of people started walking together on the bridge, the footsteps of people synchronized with each other automatically. The Millennium Bridge was designed in such a way that the cables were supporting it from the sides, not from above. It is the basic rule of civil engineering and especially of structural engineering. During the designing of a footbridge, its resonant frequency is not set according to the footsteps of people. While sitting on a swing, when we move our legs back and forth according to its frequency, it starts moving faster automatically. Similarly, when people started walking together on the Millennium Bridge, the frequency of their footsteps matched with the frequency of the bridge. At first the bridge started swaying slowly, as the supporting cables were attached to the sides, therefore the movement of the bridge was sideway. Due to this sideway movement, now people started walking sideway to balance themselves. And then due to resonance, the movement of the bridge went on faster and faster like a swing. When the problem was diagnosed properly, the engineers installed 89 shock absorbers. 37 to dissipate energy and 52 shock absorbers were installed to control the vertical movement. After completing their work, in February 2002, the bridge was tested once again. The company arranged more than 2,000 people and asked them to walk on the bridge. This test is known as one of the biggest bridge tests in the world. A satisfactory decrease in the movement of the bridge was seen as predicted. Even today, it is a very difficult task to predict synchronization and to find invisible connection between two or more than two bodies. This is a natural phenomenon which can also be observed in birds when they fly together. When bees are together, not only their sound is synchronized, but they also tug their wings unanimously when they feel danger from outside while being on the hive, as it can be seen in this video. Hope you like the video. If you like the video, please share it. Please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for more videos notifications. Thanks. See you in the next video.